Hey, this is Miles with Tactical Hyve. A few weeks ago, I took a 2-day Carbine class with Dan Brokos. Dan is a retired U.S. Army Special Forces Sergeant Major who spent 21 years of his 26 years in service in Special Forces. Dan's also the founder of Lead Faucet Tactical. Dan's 2-day Carbine class combined clear instruction with a lot of shooting, a lot of movement, transitions from strong and support side, and shooting from a lot of different positions. He also kept things really exciting by offering up incorporating friendly competitions among the students with different prizes. Stick with me for the next 10 minutes as we take a closer look at his class. Dan's 2-day Carbine class was advertised as an intermediate level class. Registering for the class, however, I was a little concerned it might really be for beginners because I've attended a number of classes in the past that were advertised as intermediate or advanced, but really weren't. Fortunately, Dan's Carbine class exceeded my expectations, with a heavy emphasis on tactical drills, including stationary and non-stationary positions, as well as shooting in and around cover from various shooting positions. The fact that more than half a dozen of the students were law enforcement, including SWAT members and deputies, was also a good sign. Because of this, I think Dan's class is suited for shooters who already have the fundamentals of rifle marksmanship down and can safely manipulate their weapons, or blasters as Dan likes to call them. The class required students to bring a carbine with a sling and an optic of choice, ammo, eye and ear protection, 4 magazines, and 1,200 rounds. Some students wore plate carriers and battle belts, but they were not required. As this was a carbine class, students did not need to bring a pistol or a pistol holster. The class was divided into 2 days. Day 1 started with a classroom talk where Dan briefly discussed what students can expect. I really liked how he was open about there being more than one way to do things, and that his goal was to have each student leave the class with 1 or 2 golden nuggets. He then discussed zeroing, line of sight, bore axis, and trajectory, and their relevance to the course. Dan ended the classroom session with a safety brief to ensure everyone knew what to do in case of an emergency. After the classroom, we walked to the range and started by zeroing at 50 yards from the prone position. Everyone had ample amount of time to zero their carbines, with Dan advising students on how much to adjust their windage and elevation settings. After zeroing, he touched on trigger manipulation and the importance of pulling the trigger straight to the rear, and how for precision shooting, he recommends pinning the trigger back instead of immediately resetting it after a shot breaks. We then moved on to a series of shooting drills to work on the fundamentals of rifle marksmanship, with a focus on stance. He demonstrated everything he taught and gave students a lot of time to practice. He continually watched each student to help with any issues.
Stand easy. One at a time, I'm going to come to you. Present the weapon like you're going to shoot. More. There we go, good.
Dan emphasized the importance of placing weight on the balls of our feet and distributing most of our weight to our front leg. With a good stance, we should be able to manage recoil better during a string of shots. He also discussed buttstock placement and how he recommends that the buttstock shouldn't be collapsed in too close. Instead, it should be extended out to help manage recoil. Students were encouraged to experiment with the length of their buttstock to find the length that works best for them, as everyone's body makeup is a little different. To reinforce key learning points, we ran his half and half drill, which required students to shoot 10 rounds in 10 seconds from 20 yards, 10 rounds in 5 seconds from 10 yards, and 10 rounds in 2.5 seconds from 5 yards. The target was an 8-inch circle. The drill also highlighted how one's stance needs to be stable as one gets closer to the target and needs to fire more quickly. We moved on to his 50-5 drill, where Dan placed more focus on trigger manipulation rather than stance. The drill required students to shoot a string of shots within 5 seconds from 50 yards, 40 yards, then 30 yards. Students could shoot as many shots as possible within 5 seconds, with the goal of landing as many as possible in an 8-inch circle. Dan gave students ample time to rep each drill, and for each drill, students got 1 trial run, then 2 or more runs that were timed and scored.
Fire!
In the afternoon, we began to engage multiple targets. Dan emphasized moving quickly, leading with our eyes, then our hips. He discussed flock shooting and how he modifies his drills to avoid this. Flock shooting occurs when one shoots multiple targets and in fixed order with a fixed number of rounds. Think of a shooter clearing a 6 target plate rack. The shooter moves from one plate to the other in order after one shot. Dan likes to avoid this because in a gunfight, we won't know how many shots it's going to take to put someone down, and targets may not be in any kind of logical order. This way of thinking teaches one to ensure a target is down before moving on to a different target. The drill helped us work on multiple target transitions as well as throttle control.
3, 1, fire!
The rest of the afternoon was dedicated to shooting and moving, where we started with forward movement, then lateral movement, and ending with a shooting and moving drill that tied everything together. When it comes to shooting and moving, Dan emphasized a couple of key points. One, it's important for shooters to shorten their stride and bend their knees to act as shock absorbers. And two, to move only as fast as one can accurately hit a target. A shooter's sights or red dot will tell him or her if anything is wrong. If a shooter is doing everything right, his or her sights or red dot on target should be moving around much less than when normally walking. As mentioned earlier, Dan observed all students and corrected any problems he saw as the need arose.
Check it out. You're standing right here. Drop. And do it. Okay.
The next day we started out by checking where our blasters were at 100 yards prone. For those who wanted to, this was an opportunity for them to zero their carbines at this distance. We then immediately moved on to shooting from the rollover prone position where our carbines were turned at a 90-degree angle. Dan taught and demonstrated the position, and we got to shoot from both our strong and support sides. From the rollover prone position, Dan talked to us about how our shots wouldn't hit where our red dots were, and we all confirmed this ourselves. We noticed that our shots were about 6 to 8 inches off from wherever we placed our red dot. Dan taught us how to compensate for this while also driving in the point that we should be careful of malfunctions as our carbine's ejection port might be too close to the ground when shooting from the rollover prone position. After, we worked on transitioning our rifle from our strong side to our support side and back. We drilled this drive for a while, then moved on to live fire transition drills. With support side shooting from longer distances, one needs to ensure that their line of sight and bore axis are aligned to ensure accurate shots. With an optic, this can be difficult and/or time-consuming. Dan's fix is to use our front sight posts. All we had to do was line up our red dots with the front sight and fire. This was the golden nugget for me. Before using my front sight, my support side shots were off target using only my red dot. Once I lined up the red dot and front sight, my accuracy increased dramatically. After working our support side, Dan took us through different shooting position drills using barricades. We worked shooting from cover, both standing and kneeling. When it comes to shooting from cover, Dan discussed how pieing out and being a foot or two away from cover is what is traditionally taught, but in his experience, this approach won't allow one to land a lot of shots quickly and accurately. Instead, Dan likes to fully utilize cover by getting right on it and using it and his body to support his weapon. He feels this is the best way to get accurate shots on target quickly. Kneeling behind cover, Dan teaches that a shooter's outside knee should always be up for stability. He demonstrated how easy it is for one to fall over if their outside knee is down. He's received some criticism for this because it can potentially leave some parts of a shooter's body exposed, including one's femoral artery. But to Dan, a person needs to ask themselves, are they hiding or are they fighting? Dan prefers an aggressive mindset with a slight exposure of his body versus a defensive mindset. After shooting from barricades, from standing and kneeling, we got down and dirty, shooting from cover, from rollover prone, and inverted kneeling positions. He taught us different ways to manage recoil from these positions, depending on how one holds their weapon, and continually reiterated the importance of using our front sight with our optic, aiming high on our magazine side to compensate for the 90-degree cant of our carbines. We also did some junkyard shooting drills. This is where we took cover behind barrels and shot with our weapon canted 90 degrees. Dan taught us the proper way to shoot from this position, including controlling our optic with our fingers to manage recoil. He also reminded us to be aware of how our carbine setup might affect placement of our weapon on the barrel, and how we should avoid placing our carbine's ejection port flat on a barrel, as this will cause a malfunction. The afternoon was dedicated to drilling, and students got a lot of firing time. This was a great opportunity for all students to work on the material they learned throughout the class. Shooting and moving, transitions, using barricades, and shooting from different positions, we drilled everything, with Dan always keeping an eye out the entire time and correcting students when needed. We moved on to a relay race where the entire class was divided into two teams that competed against each other. The course of fire was broken into different stages, so to speak, where students got to work on what they learned from the class. Every team had to adhere to the same course of fire, and the first team to complete the course of fire won. The day ended with a buddy run competition, which I thought was a lot of fun. We all picked a partner and had a set course of fire. The team to finish the fastest won. My partner and I did very well, but we were beat by 2 SWAT members who took first place. Better luck next time, I guess. If you have your rifle fundamentals down and you're looking to send a lot of lead down range, I highly recommend Dan's class. He combined great instruction with a lot of shooting time. Dan's class was safe, a lot of fun, well organized, and it exceeded my expectations. To add to that, Dan is just an overall great guy who, to me, it seems like he just wants his students to get really good and to really improve. So if Dan rolls around your neighborhood, I highly recommend you enroll in one of his classes. This is Miles with Tactical Hyve, signing off.